I think it's really important for us to study our history as a nation and spiritually, because where we are today is the result of what the decisions that were made yesterday. And so it's important for us to understand the flow of history so we can understand where we are spiritually as a church and as a nation and across the West. So, I'm hoping this. All right, there we are. Roger Williams. There's an old picture of him, 1603 to 1683, so he was born a long time ago. So, if I were to say to you the word tolerance, which group in America claims that it is the most tolerant group? Or who proclaims the gospel of tolerance today? Is it Christians? No. Who proclaims the gospel of tolerance today? The progressive left, the hard left, social justice warriors, critical theorists, critical race theorists, critical gender theorists, the social justice warriors who beautify Portland every night with their presence. They claim that they are tolerant, that tolerance is their value. And they say that we are to be tolerant of almost everything those days, particularly that by those who proclaim the need to be tolerant of diversity, inclusivity and acceptance, the DEI group, diversity, equity and inclusion. No matter what you may believe, the only thing they're not tolerant of is actually the gospel. But where does this core American cultural value come from? Does it come from Karl Marx and Lenin? Does it come from the progressive left? Or actually does it come from our Protestant history? And it's important to know our history, because when someone says, you need to be tolerant, we need to understand that they're actually co-opting a Protestant value, not a Marxist value. Marxism is not tolerant. It seeks to eliminate any opposition to Marxist ideology. So, we're going to have a quick sweep through history here. We're going to look at the... is it actually plugged in, the remote for this? No. All right. So we're good now, I think. All right, so that's where we're going to go on our journey this afternoon. Okay, the English context for Roger Williams, his early years, his early time in America, his time with the Narragansetts, a Native American community in modern-day Rhode Island and Connecticut, his key contributions to religious liberty, and his legacy today. And so we're going to go through these topics here. And all right, so the English context for Roger Williams. So you're very familiar with this quote here: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts what?" And this was written by a guy called Lord Acton, who was a Catholic historian and lord in the British House of Lords. And he was reflecting on the 1,000 years of British history from 1066 up until the end of the 19th century. Now, in 1066, if you're not familiar with your British history, England was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and we had a king called, what was his name? Alfred? No, not Alfred. No. William killed him. He got an arrow in his eye. Okay, the last English Anglo-Saxon king. Okay, it's late in the day. So, he fought a battle against the Vikings in York in the north. And then Duke William, he was the Norman Prince of Normandy in northern France. He invaded the south coast of England. It was King Harold. And Harold marched south with his Anglo-Saxon fighters. And there was a battle, and this was memorialized in the Bayeux Tapestry. You've heard of the Bayeux Tapestry? And in that Bayeux Tapestry, there's a picture of a Norman arrow piercing the eye of the English king, and the English army collapsed. And William the Conqueror, who used to be William the Duke of Normandy, became William the Conqueror. And so modern British history started in 1066, and he took a census of Britain called the Domesday Book in 1086. And many towns today trace their ancestry back to that Domesday Book in 1086. And the 1,000 years of British history up until the time of Lord Acton at the height of the British Empire, he could reflect and say that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the history of the British Isles from the time of William the Conqueror all the way through to Lord Acton was a time of constant struggle between political absolutism, that is kings demanding the divine right of kings to rule without the input of the people, between an ecclesiastical hierarchy that was dictatorial in nature, that was the Catholic Church, and also the thirst for individual liberty. And the first eruption in British history was the Magna Carta in 1215. You've heard of Magna Carta, yes? That enshrines many of the common law rights we have in America today, such as trial by jury and habeas corpus. And we should be grateful today that the guys who fought King John, and they produced this document, this Bill of Rights. Those rights are the foundation of our common law rights in America today. And there's an addendum, it's called the 20th paragraph, it's not in this one, which said that if the king does not obey the charter and uphold the rights of the people, then the barons have a legal obligation to rise up in arms against the king and compel him to honour the rights of the people that are enshrined in the charter. And that's the basis of the Second Amendment today, that the people have the rights to enforce the government upholding their civil rights. And if the government doesn't uphold their civil rights, then the people have a duty to enforce them so the next generation can enjoy the rights that are being taken away from us. So you have Magna Carta, you then have in 1381 the Peasants' Revolt, and led by a guy called Tyler, and he was captured and he was hung, drawn and quartered. But there was a boy king, Richard II, who met the rebels. And this was caused, this was just after the plague, or some call it the Black Death, and it wiped out about a third of the peasants. And so now the peasants were in such short supply, they worked the land, the basis of all wealth, but they wanted to move from one employer to other to get better wages. And the nobles were saying, no, you're tied to the land. And so the peasants had a revolt in 1381, and that was the start of the shift of power from the barons to what you have today, is you have the ability to work in any state of the United States, and without asking anybody's permission. And that goes all the way back to the Peasants' Revolt, when the peasants said, we are an economic asset, and if this lord wants to pay us more than this lord, we should be able to go and work for that lord. And then you have, after the Peasants' Revolt, you have the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and this translates into the troubles of Northern Ireland of today. We had a Catholic king, he wasn't Catholic, but people thought he was Catholic, and so he was James II, and Parliament didn't want a Catholic king, so they invited this guy here, who's called Duke William of Orange, in northern Netherlands, Holland. They invited him to be king, and they threw out the King of England, Parliament did, and put this guy on the throne. And that's the start of a constitutional monarchy, where the king is no longer absolute, but he rules with the consent of the people. And William of Orange, William of England there, he went to Ireland and he defeated the Catholic army of James II, and that's why in Northern Ireland, have you heard of the Orangemen? Yeah, the Protestants march around with their drums, and they march with these big kettle drums, which is what William II had in his army. They're banging those drums in front of the Catholics of Belfast, letting them know that in about 1690 or so, we beat you guys at the Battle of the Boyne, and we established Protestant supremacy rather than Catholic supremacy. There's a long history there. But anyway, this was the context into which Roger Williams was born. Now, you've heard of this guy here, Henry VIII? Yeah. How many wives did he have? 6 wives, okay? And he was kind of a character. He was kind of like the Donald Trump of his era, bigger than life. And he had a suit made out of golden velvet, and the King of France, he wanted to invade France, and so he sent the King of France a message of saying, I'm going to come and fight you. And the King of France sent him back a box of tennis balls and said, just go and play tennis at Windsor. And in response, King Henry sent him back a box of cannonballs and said, no, this is what we're going to play with. So anyway, his first wife was a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, and she wasn't able to have children. We think it was her, wasn't able to have children. So he wanted a new wife, but he was Catholic, and the Pope would not allow him to annul the marriage. So what did he do? He just declared himself head of the Church of England, and he said, now we have the Church of England, or the Episcopalian Church of today, and we no longer recognise the supremacy of the Pope. Now the King of England is the head of the Church of England. He went off and married a girl called Anne Boleyn, and didn't do her any good because he took her head off a few years later. So anyway, what this guy did was he took a Catholic church, and he didn't change the structure of the Catholic Church so much, but he just imposed Calvinist theology onto the Catholic hierarchy of England, and Calvinists are driven by the concept of predestination, the idea that God has already determined who's going to be lost and who's going to be saved, and so it really doesn't matter what you do. If you're irredeemably lost, there's nothing you can do, and if you're irredeemably saved, there's nothing you can do. And so the Calvinists have this idea of predestination, but when he died, He was followed by one of his daughters called Queen Mary. And it's from her that we get the phrase Bloody Mary. You've heard of the cocktail, Bloody Mary? And why is it called that? Because she spilled so much Protestant blood. And during her time, she killed a lot of Protestants, and she returned England to being a Protestant nation. And she was hated up and down the land. And during her time, this book was written, Fox's Book of Martyrs. Have you read that? And what we had was, whether it was Henry VIII, we have a union of church and state, where the king is the head of the Church of England. Even say in England, the King Charles is now the head of the Church of England. We have a union of church and state. And under Mary, we were reunited with the papacy, where the papacy is supreme over the state. And when Mary died, she was followed by her younger sister, Elizabeth, who was really a magnificent monarch, you might say. And she never married, but she was a devout Protestant. And she passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the monarch to be the supreme governor of the Church of England. This meant that any challenge to the church in England would be considered a challenge to the crown, and thus be considered treason. So even though she inspired people to sail around the world, we beat the Spanish Armada and all kinds of technological advances in her reign, and Shakespeare was around at that time, she passed the Act of Supremacy, which said that the supreme ruler in the Church of England is the monarch, and to challenge the church means you're challenging the Queen, King or Queen, and that's an act of treason. And so there arose in Britain a tradition of what we call dissenters, the dissenting tradition of people who would not go along with the dictates of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And there was the Common Book of Prayer. We still use the Common Book of Prayer today. If you want a traditional marriage, you're going to use the words, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God to celebrate, to witness the joining together in holy matrimony of this man and this woman." Yes? You're familiar with that phrasing. That's all from the Common Book of Prayer. And we still use it today. It's magnificent language, whether it's for burial, whether it's for funeral, whether it's for dedications. It's magnificent language. So she started persecuting some of the dissenters to the supremacy of the Church of England as she understood it. And she was succeeded by this guy here, James I, King of Scotland, James Stuart. And he was King of Scotland when Elizabeth died because she didn't have any kids. This guy was invited by Parliament to become the King of England. And James gives us the King James Bible. Now, King James, the King James Bible is interesting because there's a theological flavour to the King James, and he wanted the new version of the Bible because the Puritans were not happy with the Bibles, the Bishop's Bible and the Clarendon version, and there was a few others out there, the Geneva Bible. They weren't happy with those, so the king wanted a new version of the Bible to unify the kingdom of Scotland, England and Wales, and he produced the King James Version. But the King James Version was designed for a political point, and the political point of the King James was that the king has a divine right to rule. There's a political agenda within the King James. We don't read it in that way today, but that was the point of the King James Version. In fact, it was so political that when the Pilgrim Fathers sailed to America, they banned the King James Version from crossing the Atlantic. They wanted the Bishop's Bible or the Geneva Bible. They didn't want the King James Version because the King James was viewed as being a politicized version. It was fake news, you might say, back in the day. So James Stuart comes to the throne, and this was the era of some of the most brilliant minds in Western history. Samuel Pepys, William Shakespeare, Sir Francis Bacon, and one of the greatest minds, legal minds, in the last 1,000 years was this guy called Sir Edward Coke. And this guy was one of the most brilliant lawyers in the last 1,000 years anywhere in the West, and his writings still shape pretty much every Western democracy today. And he used to write like a legal update every month and publish it, and lawyers still read that in law school. The common law reasoning is absolutely brilliant. It's Edward Coke. And why do we talk about these lawyers? Well, Henry, what's his name? Shakespeare wrote a play called Henry VI, and in Part 2, Act 4, Scene 2, one of the characters says this: the first thing we're going to do is let's kill all the lawyers. You've heard that phrase, let's kill the lawyers? Apologies for any lawyers present here today. Now, what was Shakespeare saying in that point? In that play, Shakespeare was making the point that when you have autocratic rulers seeking to trample on the rights of the people, who stands up for the people? It's the lawyers do. And so autocratic rulers hate lawyers because lawyers stand up for the rights of the people that the absolutist rulers want to do away with. So in Shakespeare's play, he said, let's kill all the lawyers. And we laugh about it because, you know, lawyers don't have the best reputation these days in some areas. But Shakespeare was making the point that lawyers are essential in a society if your rights are to be defended. And this guy here, Sir Edward Coke, he was the mentor for Roger Williams. Now, he argued for 30 years, this guy here, in the court of James I and in Charles I's court. He argued that the monarch was subject to the law and the monarch was not above the law. Now, James I and then Charles I, who was eventually killed by Cromwell, they pushed the idea of the divine rights of kings, which is the idea that comes from the King James Version of the Bible. And Charles I cancelled the Parliament and ruled by personal dictate for almost 20 years, while this guy was a lawyer. And in those days, persecution of political and religious dissenters was brutal. That is, your ears and your nose could be sawn off, your tongues could be drilled through, dissenters were tortured to death or left to rot in prison. You've heard of Pilgrim Progress? Yes. The most fearsome punishment was hanging, drawing and quartering, reserved for traitors. Any of you familiar with hanging, drawing and quartering? So the first thing we do is we hang you the American way, not the British way. This is kind of a little side show here, but when the Americans hang you, they put the rope with a knot here. And when you jerk at the bottom, the rope goes to the back of the neck. And it doesn't break your neck, it just strangles you. So you kick around for a few minutes, yes? You've seen that in the movies. The British way of hanging you is to put the knot at the back of the neck, and then when it snaps shut at the bottom, the knot comes round here and it snaps the spinal column into it. It's instant death. So where you put the knot has a big impact on how quickly you were killed. So if the kings wanted to kill a traitor, they hanged in the American way, which meant we half strangled you. Then we would draw you, hang drawing meant that you were drawn on a horse naked through the streets of London, so that all the skin was taken off the back. And then they would quarter you, which meant they put you on like an altar, tie your hands and legs apart and open you up and take out your entrails and burn them organ by organ while you're still alive. And a skilled executioner would pull out your heart as the last organ to, then you'd be dead. But they pull out your entrails, they pull out your spleen, they pull out your liver, and it'd be burnt in front of you. And so people really didn't want to be traitors. And it was a fearsome penalty. This was captured in the movie Braveheart. At the end of the movie Braveheart, they kind of tone it down in that it wasn't as good as it should have been. But there were huge crowds. Whenever there was a hanging, drawing and quartering, everybody came to watch it, huge crowds, because this was the best show in town, you might say. So Edward Coke, he risked his life by standing up for the liberties of civilians and citizens, and also for their religious liberties. Well, eventually there was a war. This guy here, Oliver Cromwell, in the middle there, he defeated the King of England in a 6-year civil war. Those are the Roundheads there, they beat the Cavaliers. Those are the King's soldiers, and eventually the King was executed in 1649, and Cromwell became the Lord Protector, and British colonies sprang up all around the world during his 10 years in control. Now, why is it significant to us? Because Roger Williams was a protege of Sir Edward Coke. And how did he become his protege? Because Roger Williams was a poor boy, and he was enrolled by his parents in a poor boys' grammar school, and Edward Coke needed a boy to take shorthand notes for him. You know what shorthand is, yes? It's like where you write, you can capture a sentence just with a few squiggles. And he went to this grammar house and he said to the principal, he said, I want a small boy who can take shorthand very efficiently. And the principal said, yeah, I've got a young poor boy here, his name is Roger Williams. So Edward Coke said, okay, I'll take that young boy there. So Roger Williams, as like 10, 11 years old, he was suddenly taking these word-by-word dictation notes. Every time Edward Coke had a confrontation with the king, this little boy was writing it all out in shorthand. And he followed for 20 years almost all these legal meetings, the conflicts between Parliament and King, between Cromwell and the King, between Edward Coke and the leader of the Royalists. This young man was taking all these notes, and he was learning at the same time. And one of the lessons for us today is, young people, you may not think that learning a skill has any real use for God's kingdom, but because he was faithful and he learned how to do shorthand as a small boy, he became one of the greatest minds in American history, with a profound influence upon us today. So learning a simple skill God can use that to have a profound influence for many, many people around the world. So Roger Williams, he was doing the notes in shorthand from the momentous meetings between the king and the judges like Cook, the High Court debates, and he found himself taking shorthand notes at the centre of a brutal power struggle that would come to define our democracy today. Europe had gone autocratic under the Catholic kings of Europe. Would England, the last functioning democracy, likewise succumb to autocratic rule? Or would principles of democracy thrive? And Roger Williams captured all of those debates in shorthand.
To be aware of new videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Preparing for the Time of Trouble channel. For more free videos and downloadable audio podcasts, as well as handouts, go to www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Topic categories include recordings of live seminar presentations, country living, sustainable gardening, homestead remedies, how to be self-sufficient when the grid goes down, wild edible and medicinal plants, hydrotherapy, and end-time Bible prophecies. To take advantage of these free resources, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.